Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary with Karl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion, or we want to be contemplative, or simply ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to welcome you to our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that resonate with our fellow friends and seekers here in the desert.
Our hope is that you will find life for your body, soul, and spirit.
And now, here is our show.
Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. I'm Laura Forehand. I'm here with Karl, and we're glad that you're joining us today on the podcast. How are things going, Karl?
Well, I think they're going good. We got to take a vacation for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Just sit and do nothing at your sister's house.
Yeah.
And jump in the pool every once in a while. It was nice to do that.
Yeah.
But I also have some other things. We're going to be speaking in a couple of weeks at the Wild Goose.
Well, we meaning you, but
You will be supporting.
I'll be there in the audience.
You'd be heckling me from the audience.
Well, yes, I will be in the audience.
Yes, that's in a couple of weeks,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We speak first speaker on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know what they were trying to accomplish with putting me first, but anyway. Well, also the book Leaning Forward is finished, and we have our artwork for the cover, and it'll be out soon.
Yeah, for
right.
sure. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but that's not why we're here today. We want to talk to Lauren Rose today. Lauren is one of the first ways she introduced herself to me as Jane Doe number 4.
Yes.
In the lawsuit against Bill Gothard. So, but Laura's gonna read a quick bio, and then we'll
Get going.
yeah.
Okay, so as a survivor, now thriver, Lauren Rose advocates for women who are victims of coercive control, domestic abuse, and sexual abuse. Her desire for truth and justice led her to become Jane Doe number 4 in the lawsuit against Bill Gothard. She currently works full-time for Called to Peace Ministries, a domestic abuse advocacy, as communications coordinator, where she loves providing education, support, hope, and peace for those impacted by abuse. Abuse and coercion may have been part of my story, but it isn't the end. What I've experienced now drives me to use my voice, knowledge, and understanding to let others know it doesn't have to be the end of your story either. Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary, Lauren. We're glad that you're here.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here. So thank you for having me today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like we were talking about before we started recording, we consider it a privilege that you would share your sacred story with us. And we also realize some of the things you've been through, and that sometimes that's hard. But we want to invite you to be authentic and speak from your heart. And I think that was your desire also. So take it away. Tell us as little or as much as you want, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, sure. And also something else that I didn't mention in my bio is I'm part of a new documentary that's coming out called Until the Truth. And it's with me and 3 other plaintiffs. There's other plaintiffs too, but it follows the lives of us 4. And what does the journey recovery look like? And it's going to be over the past 4 years. And that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about today. Is not necessarily the documentary, but my journey of recovery. And what does that look like? And as we were talking before we came on here, my views of Christianity, if you had asked me in my teens when I became a Christian and made a profession of faith, was I viewed it as workspace, being, doing all the right things, saying all the right things, and a formula of success. Although I did know God, now I would view it as it's a wrestling with God. It's an intimate knowing of God And my journey has been that of wrestling with God for answers, and asking him why. There was times that I committed and surrendered my life to Jesus and wanted nothing more to please him. But there was a point that my life ended up so damaged, so broken from literally following God, that I was like, I don't think I can be a Christian. I just don't think I can. And that's where I want to talk about that authentically. And how come a lot of times people hear my story and they ask, how are you still a Christian? How did you make it through this? And the answer is God. It's a story of God literally meeting to me, speaking to me, calling me to himself, and using people that were literally the hands and feet of Jesus to me, and were love. And those weren't always the people in church. Now I am. I know there's wonderful churches out there. And sometimes those who profess to be Christians can also be the ones who cause us the most hurt in life. And that was my story.
Yeah. I think we can relate to that a little bit,
Yeah.
as far as like people in the church being hurtful. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And especially you're involved in a high control religion. Would you call it that?
Yes, I view Bill Gothard as a false gospel. He's like the Pharisees and the Sadducees is how I would view it in a Christian perspective. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. They're the ones that crucified Jesus. They used religion to get them what they wanted: power and authority, control, prestige. But Bill Gothard did not know Jesus. I knew that when I worked for him, and I'll get into my story of literally God revealing himself to me and walking me out and showing me truth, and realizing that truth is worth fighting for because it's the only thing that will set us free. And sometimes that takes challenging everything we've been taught in life to find the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So continue on with your story. There's more to tell, right?
Yeah. So I'll just start from the beginning. So my family,
Okay.
My family became Christians when I was 12, actually. I was at a prestigious boarding school. I was planning to go to be well educated and be successful. That's how I was raised. My parents became Christians and we began homeschooling. And I was like, this is crazy. I was very much, I'm not into this. I'm not, just kind of distance. And then I became a Christian when I was 17. I saw the reality of God in some young people, and I decided this is what I wanted. And I made a profession of faith, and I started walking with God. And at this point, I don't want to go into my whole story, but we'll go into, my family ends up in the IBLP program when I was 17 years old. I wanted nothing to do with it. I was like, this is a cult. I was like, you're going to ruin my life. I actually told Bill Gothard off when I met him at 16, and he tried to suck me into his program. And I literally told him I'm going to a university and was very smart with him. He actually stood up in front of the stage. This is kind of funny, in front of 20,000 people that night, and told everybody he had met the most hard-hearted girl he had ever met, and that I was more hard-hearted than any gang member he had ever worked with. I was not. I was just a very determined individual that was not going to settle for any of this. But flash forward, I did, and I want to talk about that. So part of my story is I am also a child sexual assault survivor. I was gang raped at the age of 11. It was really horrific. I went into 4th stage trauma, which means I survived by dissociation amnesia. That means I've completely blocked the memory from my mind until I was 18. I remembered it because I was one day deciding I felt something was blocking me, and I was like, I need to know what this is. So I started praying. I spent a lot of time in prayer. I was very conservative at this point. I'll talk more about that. And I started asking God, everybody in my life I need to forgive. And I just started forgiving people. And God then told me about the memory of being raped as a kid. And then God said, you're not ready to know yet, but this is what happened. And I can remember before and after, and I knew it had happened. And I started forgiving them at that moment. And then my parents sent me to a program called Excel. It is a Bill Gothard finishing program. Even though I cannot remember the memories of being raped, the stuff they taught me there made me leave feeling so worthless as a victim of sexual abuse. I was taught that unless you had your virginity, you weren't precious in life. You didn't matter. No man would want you, and you were just damaged goods. That was literally everything. When Bill Gothard met you, he asked you if you were a virgin or not. So leaving there, I felt like now I'm worthless. And I've also been taught now that my whole goal in life is to be married, and that men are out there as predators. And I was taught these things, and I believed it. And I believed in order to get married and be what God wanted me to be, I was going to have to be perfect. I was going to have to compensate and perfect. So I took my strong will. I decided I was going to be the perfect ATI girl. And I went to their Bible college, got my Bible degree in complete IBLPism. I don't even know what you want to call it. And I still had a desire to know God, and God was still drawing me to himself. And I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, in prayer. And I also spent a lot of time fasting, because that's just what we do. And I would fast a lot. And one day I told God I wanted to know about those memories that were hidden in my life, the memories I couldn't have. And I want to flash forward to this point. As a conservative ATI girl, I listened to hymns in classical only. I didn't have friends outside the home. My brother and sisters were my only friends. I wasn't allowed to go to college. I was very much like sheltered and controlled, kind of like that's just our environment. So I didn't watch movies. I don't have a time period where I can even relate to things that went on in the world at that time, because I didn't have a secular experience. I wasn't even allowed to go to the singles group in my church because they might corrupt me. So I spent my time in prayer. I wasn't allowed to have a job outside the home either. It was a no-no too. So I spent my time in prayer because I didn't know what else to do. That was my outlet. And I told God I wanted to know these memories. And so God said, go fast and pray and I'll tell you. And so I said, okay. So I went and I started fasting and praying. And by the end of the day, I said, all right, God, I fasted all day. I'm ready. And God hit me at that moment. It was the Holy Spirit with my first flashback. And I remembered it. And I couldn't remember very much, but I remembered parts of it. Flash forward 6 months later, I am in full-blown PTS and having full memories of this. And it is horrific. I probably have PTS from remembering it. But in IBLP, you're not allowed to seek therapy. You're not allowed to do counseling. You're not allowed to do anything like that. You are only taught that the Bible is your only answers for anything and everything. And anybody who did therapy and all of that was messed up. So it was me and Jesus. I literally worked through memories of my childhood of this sexual assault by praying. And I would spend the day just praying and asking God to speak the truth. I would tell him the lie I'm believing and listen for the truth. And I would do it. It's basically like cognitive behavior therapy. And there was a lot of pain in my heart. I was very much suffering and hurting. And that was what sustained me. And so then I graduated from their Bible college at the same time. And I went to an IBLP conference. And I saw these Romanians up on stage. And I said, God, I want to work with those Romanian government leaders. And God said, I want you to, too. I was like, okay, well, God, if it's your will for me to work with those Romanian government leaders, how about you send Bill Gothard to ask me? Later that day, I am with the young people, and it's about 2,500 people there at the conference. And Bill Gothard approaches me, and we just say hello back and forth. And he says, how would you like to come work with the Romanian government? My mouth about hit the floor, and I was like, I would love to. So I came and I went to headquarters, and that's how I connected with Bill Gothard. I was still very deeply hurting. I was still processing through these memories. And I was immediately by Bill Gothard singled out. And he said he'd been watching me, and he noticed that that there was something unique about me, and that he was very impressed with me. And so he asked us to pray together on his couch. And so I began praying with him. And as we prayed, we were done praying, and he looks at me and he says, when you pray, you touch heaven. I feel like you call heaven down here. You really know God. I said, yes, I do. I said, I've been through some really hard things in life, and I do know God. He says, you remind me of an old staff girl. And I haven't had this type of fellowship with a girl in a very long time. He's like, I feel like I've been waiting for you to come here for a long time. He's like, this is no longer going to be my ministry. This is going to be our ministry. And I said, who is this staff girl? And he says, oh, she's a girl from the 90s. And I said, okay. So 2 days later, I'm riding up in his little blue van, because now I've been singled out by Bill Gothard, and I'm pretty much going to be his female assistant. So what he's described me as, I'm going to work in his office. I've been selected and chosen. And so, of course, I'm elated. But, this means I must be the perfect ATI girl, right? And so I'm riding in his office, up in his little blue van, and he hands me a letter. And it's a letter that's already been opened. It's a letter that's already been read. and I began to read it. And as I'm reading it, it was the Holy Spirit. And it said, I felt like something impressed me, that something is inappropriate between this man and this woman. And I looked at him, and he was off in a lustful state. And I was shocked. And I was like, what? And then I didn't know what to do in that moment. And so I looked at him in the face and I said, what do you mean to do with this letter? He's like, do you mean rip it to shreds for you? And that moment I watched him jolt out of his little fantasy world and try to snatch it from my hands. But before he did, I took the letter and I turned it and looked to the side and I said, I have to know his name. So I flipped over and I saw the name. It said Meg. And I was like, Meg, who's Meg? I knew something was very inappropriate between him and her. And I wondered if this was the girl I reminded him of. And you're going to find out that this girl is a key connection for me getting out later. It's going to be a crazy, crazy story. I'm telling you this for a reason. So now, 2 days later, again, I'm back in his office. And I'm watching young girls come in and out of his office, all these beautiful girls. And like I said, I had my degree in Bill Gothardism. Like, I knew all of his books. I read all of his wisdom booklets. I knew all of his material inside and out. It's my degree. So I recognize when he's not following his own principles really fast. So I'm watching him light up and look at young girls. And there was something really wrong. And so that was that moment. I just looked at God. I remember praying out loud and I said, God, what is going on here? And I heard God speak to me. It was one of the moments in my life I've never heard God speak to me so hard. And God said, I've seen everything here. And someday I'll use you in court to testify against him. And I was like, what? And I couldn't understand that. I will tell you, I ended up telling Bill Gothard that I had been sexually abused as a kid. And in that moment, he usually liked sexually abused girls. He actually, that's what he looked for. Later, you'll find out that he used me to go find them because he said they had a special potential. So he looked for girls who've been sexually abused. And, but when I told him that wasn't the response I got, he got really sad, almost like he was about to cry. And he said, there's nothing here for you to do anymore. You're going to go home. And I was like, okay, I don't know what I've done. So I left and I felt like God said, you're not leaving. I have a testimony for you. You're not going to go. So anyway, Bill Gothard finds out I can do public speaking really well and tell stories about God applying things in my life. And I end up staying and I end up going to his office for counseling. And it was really, 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 really horrific. And the documentary will get more into that. But I will just say, basically, I was blamed for the rape. I was taught that I was wrong. He made me tell him details of it repeatedly while he was off in the lust and staring there. He told me I sinned against God in being raped. He made me confess my sins. And then when I left that night, the final time I went counseling, he grabbed me, pulled me into his suit jacket. I felt my chest smash against his. He looked directly in my face and I could tell he was going to kiss me. I froze dead in my tracks. I began backing out as fast as I could. I never, ever went back to his office again. That night, my face hit the pillow and I began to pray about 9 p.m. at night. I prayed until 1 a.m. in the morning and all I did was pray and say, God, take this pain from my heart. I had no other place to turn at this point. There's nowhere to go. Bill Gothard had told me, tell your parents, thank you that you never got counseling from a therapist because they would have ruined you. Only I know how to help abused women. And as I help you, we're going to bond together. And this is going to be our ministry. So I didn't know where else to turn. I couldn't talk to a counselor. They would ruin me. And I've now made a 2-year vow to stay for Bill Gothard. I am trapped. So I pray from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. All I say is, God, take this pain in my heart. At 1 a.m., God spoke to me and God said, I have heard your pleas as a widow begging before me, and I have answered. The pain is gone. And you know what? I've never felt pain in my heart again since that day from sexual abuse. The pain is gone. There's no emotional pain. It does not mean the psychological damage was not done because I still had to do a lot of therapy before that. But that's my story. And so I will say I ended up working for Bill for several years. 3 years. I ended up very controlled. There was points and times that I was starved. I wasn't allowed food. I didn't eat. I was forced to work, all types of stuff that really ruined my health. I enjoyed sometimes it, and I could hold my own for the most part with him. I had favor. I would catch him not obeying his own principles, and then I'd flip them on him and say, well, isn't this what you teach? Why aren't you doing it? So somehow he still liked me and I still remained. But anyway, so I ended up courting a guy that actually called Bill Gothard to get his permission and did a whole interview with him. But I don't want to go into that whole story just for my own sacred things. I didn't feel peace about that marriage. I didn't know how to get out of it because at that point in time, my will had been so suppressed. Everything had been stripped from me. Like I felt when I was alone with Bill Gothard, I want to say this, I would get very anxious. And I would feel very nervous because my body was sensing his lust. And especially as I watched young girls. So he would grab me by the hands and look me in the eyes and say, you're a young girl laden with fears. And I began to believe that all my cautions I felt in life were fears. So when I had cautions against the guy I was dating, I saw them as fears. I'm a broken, messed up individual. According to ATI, what makes me think I can make my own choices? I need somebody else to make them for me. So I get married and I ended up in what now I would call a domestically violent marriage. It was very, very abusive, but I didn't have vocabulary for abuse. Abuse had been completely stripped from my vocabulary. There was none. I was taught authorities were to control every area of my life. When I disobeyed, my husband threatened to spank me. That didn't happen. It was very, very abusive, but I thought I was worthy of that because I disobeyed and didn't do what I was supposed to do. I wasn't perfect enough. But the pain became so heavy in my marriage, I wanted to die. I just felt no reason left living because even though I didn't have vocabulary to state I'm in abuse, it was still destroying my internal soul. It was destroying my spirit. Every part of my being was dying inside from the counseling Bill gave me, all of it. And so I didn't know what to do. So you know what I did? I wrote Bill Gothard a letter of gratefulness because that's what you're supposed to do when you're upset. So I decided I'm going to write him a letter of gratefulness and tell him to pray for me. He also made me write a list of gratefulness for the reasons I was abused. That was just part of life. You always make a list of gratefulness. You should be grateful that I'm abused as a kid. I don't even understand that. And then I didn't feel right. Something was wrong. So I get on my face again. I start praying and I say, God, help. And God said, go to recoveringgrace.org. So I went to this site called recoveringgrace.org, which was former ATI students exposing the teachings of Bill Gothard. And do you know whose story was there? Meg. Meg started telling her story the day before. Wow. Bill Gothard. Yeah, I saw, and I read, she was a 4-part story, and I found it, and I was reading it, and I kept reading it. He had wanted to marry her. Actually, she was 21 and he was 62. And that's her story. It's all publicly. He had asked the board permission to marry her. He was looking for a young virginal bride is what he was doing. He was scouting girls for that. That is why he asked them if they were virgins or not. So I read her story. And as I said, I already knew that there was something inappropriate. So I said, get me in touch with that girl. I need to talk to her. And she's one of my friends today. I love her so much. And so I, and several others connected and began telling stories and began putting things together. And we joined a lawsuit or formed a lawsuit against him. And that lawsuit was dropped due to the complications. And then I told them all before we joined the lawsuit, I was like, guess what? God said this to me, that someday he's going to use me in court to testify against him. They were just like, okay. So I was just like, so I was like, I think this lawsuit's going to really work. It's going to go all the way. That's not why I said to do the lawsuit. I did not initiate the lawsuit. This is just part of something I've always said, and I've always known this in the back of my mind. So when after the lawsuit drops, they come back to me and they're like, well, Lauren, we want to tell you your vision's coming true, and you are, we're going to testify against him in court. And I'm like, oh boy. So Bill Gothard at that point decided to countersue us for defamation and put a defamation lawsuit on us. He demanded I recant everything I said of him, and I told him to go to hell. And I felt so proud of that because I was like, that's not IBLP language. I'm like, you can tell that lawyer. I want you to tell him. I said, go to hell. I said, I didn't lie. I have nothing to recant. I'd rather die for the truth than to die for a lie. Now I'm going to court, and I'll see you there. So, yeah, I went to court. I was Jane Doe number 4. So, Jane Doe number 3 is Emily Anderson. She's come out publicly. So she went directly before me, and then I went directly after her in the court. And so it was a really empowering moment of my life. I was very scared. I was tapping. I was so nervous. I remember Emily, I was sitting actually next to her. She was my roommate there. I don't remember who the other girl was next to me, but I know it was white knuckling her hands. We were just squeezing each other's hands so tight, so scared, because we don't know what's going to happen. And this point, I'm like, I don't even know what's going to happen, if I'm going to perjure my record. I'm also a single mom at this point. I have fled a domestically abusive marriage, which is another part of my story. And I'm like, I don't know what my life's going to be like. And so that moment I went up there, and it was just like the Lord just told me what to say. I'd taken Law 101 and Law 102 in my Bible college with IBLP, because they have an Oprah College of Law. And so I used the tactics I learned there on the judge. I was like, well, guess he never thought this would happen, would he? So it was great. I mean, it was a very empowering moment. Like I said, he began to question me on things, and I realized he really hadn't done his own homework, and that he was wrong. So I began flipping everything on him and asking him to verify his statements and to explain it. And so anyway, that's kind of what happened. And so we were declared as, what I forgot.
Competent witnesses, right?
Yes. And then he appealed us. So we raised money and hired an appellate lawyer. And he eventually dropped it when they told him it was going to next appeal. He could be the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. And he decided not to take us there. So I was like, well, that would have been interesting. But that's my story. That is not my healing journey, but that is my story of what I went through and how I got involved in everything. And then I can also, if you have questions, we can go into, well, how did I profess faith? How did that happen? How did I wrestle through all this? Because that was just a brief glimpse of it all, kind of a timeline of what all happened, how I ended up here, how I got out. But there is a lot of wrestling with God in that, because a lot of that is, I'm saying it was very painful stuff. It's very hurtful to have trusted somebody and find out who Bill Gothard really is. And we haven't heard the worst of his stories. You know, he's a very wicked man. And, yeah.
Yeah. Listening to your story, like, people can't see the video, but I hope they can hear in your voice. I mean, there is some definite emotion in your face as you're telling the story, in your voice. So thank you so much for sharing such a tender, story with us, because that's a lot. That's a lot. One of the questions that I had, I'm going to go back to, like, when you were praying, like working through things with Jesus. When you were working through your trauma, how did you keep the shame or blame inner voice from being part of your narrative as you were, as you were praying, or, because you were told so many things, like, this is your fault, you asked for it, whatever, with all your abuse. So as you're working through this in your prayers, how did you keep that shame and that blame voice from, coming into play, I guess? Because I feel like that was my struggle, whenever I would pray. It was like that small voice would just keep saying, well, and so I'm just curious, like, how did you keep that from being part of your narrative?
Yes, and that is such a good question. And I don't think, for me, I find shame is in layers. So I don't feel like it's just like, a one-time fix in prayer that shame that's gone. Shame's a lifelong battle. I was sitting on the phone with my friend 2 days ago in out tears saying, what's wrong with me? Why did this person treat me this way? I still struggle with shame and my trauma, because that's what I was taught to do and how I was taught to cope with it. So it is a battle. It is a wrestling with God. And I would say a huge part of working through shame is learning the truth for me of who God says I am. And a lot of that has been other people that have been willing to state those things to me. And, I'm huge into Dan Allender in that type stuff and a big fan of neuroscience and how that works. But when somebody looks you in the face and is willing to hold space for your story, it does something to your brain. It heals it and rewires it. And so finding places that I've been able to tell my story and people look at me and say, that's not okay. That's not okay that he did that.
Right.
That's not who you are. That is how I've overcome shame. And it still creeps in and I still fight it. It's not a one and done thing. It's a wrestling, and it's choosing to believe the truth for me of who God says I am versus the narrative that those who are my abusers and predators that came after me said I am. Because I'm not at fault for these sexual abuse.
Right.
And that I had to deal with in therapy. That would be a lot of therapy to deal with, but like a daily basis, I'm struggling with that. I'd say it's a community. Shame dies when you tell it. It lives in secrecy. So when you can get a safe community that can hold space for you and speak the truth, I think that's where a lot of the healing comes from, that believe you. Just to be believed is huge. I feel like I would say one of the most hardest things for survivors is not just telling you is what you've been through, but to me, it's more painful is if I went to somebody trying to rescue or somebody I thought could help me and they chose not to believe me. That's secondary trauma. Right. It's so scary and it's so horrific. So like for me, it's being believed. It's holding space and saying it's not okay. And speaking the truth, and it's a community. It's not something I've done alone in isolation.
Yeah, perfect. I love that. We talk so much about all those things here on the Desert Sanctuary. So thank you for sharing that and explaining that.
One of the things I heard in your story, I heard a determined young lady that wanted to be big, that wanted to use this thing that was inside her that was strong-willed, however you want to describe that. But you wanted to be big, and then you talked about how you had to get small. And so many, especially women, have told us that story, that those the high control situations make you learn how to read a room, learn how to get small, learn how to do the things to survive as best you know how at the time, right?
Yes.
So how did you find, I would call it your inner child, that younger version of you that wanted to be big?
Like the part of me that wanted to fight? Yeah. So I would say because of trauma, and a lot of the people have been through trauma, I want to keep it to my story, but I know for me, especially it happened at the split where it was the sexual abuse. I had to learn how to fight to survive. And that part of me, when I'm triggered, I'm still a fighter. And that's how I overcome it, is by fighting. For me in life, I don't really know of any other way that when I face something that's really hard, I buckle down and I'm like, I'm going to fight through this. I'm going to fight really hard. And for me, it's holding myself back and learning what to fight for. And for me, I fight for the truth, because the truth is the only thing worth fighting for. So for me, it's like, okay, what is true? What is right? What is justice? Now, I can't pursue all justice myself. I can do what I can control, but I can't actually bring forth vengeance. But I would say that's I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say, yes, there's an innate part of me that's a fighter. That's how I survive. It's either get up and fight and climb my way out of this, or I'm literally suicidally depressed. And so I was like, I'm going to fight for the truth. And each ounce of truth I got, I was set free. So it became a fight for freedom, not freedom to be set free and like externally, although it did end up to external freedom in some ways, but it's an internal freedom that happened. And so for me, it's just, okay, what's the next thing? What do I need to do? How do I pursue this? How do I make this right? What am I called to do here?
And I think in your story, like we saw glimpses of that even in your story, even when you were, with Bill Gothard, you spoke your mind from time to time. So I feel like that part of you has always been in there. It was just, needing to show itself even more, which you did in telling your story. Yeah.
The other thing they tell us out here in the desert, a lot of people that we interviewed tell us, we ask them kind of how do you move forward? How do you get to the next step? Because you said, part of Christianity is deconstructing, basically.
Yes.
You're always questioning, you should always be able to, and so on. So as you move forward, the people I see that do well, I mean, the prediction in the church I grew up in is if you go off course, if you do anything that we're not directly prescribing, then you're going to slide off a slippery slope and there's nothing good that can come from it. But the people that have actually deconstructed, questioned what's going on and high control stuff, and that have done well, have done two things. I just want to ask you how much you resonate with this. They said, number one, we went inside. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you. They said we went inside and we learned to trust our own intuition. Yes. And when we did that, that's how we started making progress. Can you relate to that at all?
Yes, that's a huge part of healing. And my therapist has told me that many times, learning to trust my own intuition. And that's also a journey. I still struggle with that. I still immediately want to doubt myself and to not trust myself. And so that is a lifelong journey and battle for me. It is, a lot of that is going inside and being able to allow my body to feel what it needs to feel. My body knows the truth. My body knows what happened. It knows how to perceive what happened, and it knows the truth of those feelings. And so it's being willing to go inside and say, what is the truth about what I suffered? What is the truth about Bill Gothard and what he really did to me? And that is being willing, when that truth comes and hits, it's hard, it's painful, and it's dark. And it's being willing to walk into that and say, only way out of this is to feel my way out. And to feel it, to cry it, to feel the anger, all of it, and let your body acknowledge it. And then you're set free and you believe the truth and you wrestle through that in therapy and counseling, and they're speaking the truth and you're processing through that. But to me, it's been a journey of truth, just going down deep and saying, what happened? What's really true? Was it what he told me about me being raped true? That's where I had to start. I walked right into therapy right after I connected with Rachel Lee's. They told me to go into therapy at Recovering Grace. They're like, you need to get in therapy. You needed it yesterday. Please go to therapy. I walked into therapy that week and I began saying I wanted help to deal with childhood abuse memories. And he said something about Bill Gothard. I said, Bill Gothard never abused me. I just want help with childhood abuse memories. I walked in with my husband sitting next to me, my little girl, no ability to even tell you anything going on in my marriage, or even that I would need to tell you anything going on in my marriage. Like, I had to face the truth of really deep things. And then as I faced those things and I understood the truth of that, then I'm like, well, now my body's saying, what's the truth about this? And what's the truth about that? And this thing. And then before you know it, your reality starts setting in and words start setting in. I was in 40 hours of therapy. I dealt with the rape memories and Bill Gothard and untwisting them. And then I go into my counselor's office and I tell him a scenario of what happened in my marriage the night before. He looked at me completely dumbfounded and shocked and said, you never told me any of this before. And I said, well, it wasn't until I realized the truth of what Bill Gothard did to me was wrong and that the rape wasn't my fault, that now I can state that this isn't okay either. And he's like, well, what's the truth of this whole situation now? I said, I'm in an abusive marriage. And that took me 40 hours of therapy. So to me, you say, I think it's going in and starting with the little truth and saying, okay, let's dig deep. You don't know where it's going to go and you don't know where it's lead when you're going to start feeling things and start going down deep and allowing your body to process what was hidden and what was covered. But it's the only way to get free. It's the only way to find healing and wholeness is to come in and deal with those things. Because you shove them deep down inside, they're going to fester out. That's what was happening to me. I was suicidal. I wanted to die. Those things are screaming out in pain. They're screaming. Yeah. But I had to go down deep and feel it, which felt a little worse at first, but it gets better.
Yeah. So, and feel free to say, no, I don't want to share that. Because
I'm an open book. So.
I just want to make sure we honor, your story. But did you just do like talk therapy or
No,
other things?
No.
Can you talk a little bit?
So I, as an advocate, I do a lot of interviews with therapists. So I am huge into this. Sorry. I'm all for talk therapy. Talk therapy is not going to address domestic violence. It's not going to address PTSD. You got to go to a trauma certified, informed therapist that knows how to walk with you through trauma. And they can't be any therapist. This is not a biblical counselor. I'm sorry. They're not qualified to deal with trauma. You need somebody that's professional. I'm a big fan of EMDR, brain spotting, cognitive behavior therapy can be part of that. I believe the approach to healing is a whole body experience. So the body keeps the score. It's all in my body. So to heal, I got to address the body. I got to address the soul. I got to address the spirit. So a good therapist is going to be checking in with your body. It's going to be noticing and encompassing all those aspects of it. Talk therapy has its place, but I'm sure it's great, but not when you're dealing with rape trauma, sexual abuse, domestic abuse. Please go get a professional, certified trauma therapist that knows what they're doing.
Did I hear you mention tapping when you were talking about
Yes.
holding? Okay.
Yes, my therapist at the time taught me how to tap.
Yep.
So before I went up, before Bill Gothard, I was taking my feet and tapping to ground myself. So I knew grounding techniques. I was really stirred up. I have I actually have childhood PTSD. It's my diagnosis. I'm very open about that. But when my anxiety is stirred up, that's one way I can regulate and calm myself.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think that's
passionate about that.
Yeah, no. Like I've been doing a lot of, research, I guess, for lack of a better word. I've been to professional developments on, I'm a teacher, so trauma-informed classrooms and things like that. And so I just watched a documentary and this gal was dealing with her trauma and she used tapping. And I was like, this is so interesting to me because I've seen it. And I've seen like how you can teach it to children, but that's as far as it goes. But I actually saw it in action. And so when you said that word, when you were in court, you were tapping. I didn't know if it was like,
oh, sorry, I didn't think of explaining that.
Or yeah. So thank you for kind of going into that a little bit. But I completely agree with you that you need to seek out trauma-informed caregivers when you're dealing with trauma.
Yes, meaning they have certifications in trauma therapy. Like they've done their certification and their work for that. And I do believe there's a place for biblical counselors. I don't want to knock that, or regular counselors, but trauma is a different ballgame, and you can really do a lot of damage to somebody if you're not aware of what you're getting into when you start counseling them.
Exactly.
Yeah. We often do a process called focusing, and it's biospiritual focusing, really, and it was taught to me by some Benedictine nuns, and really similar to what you're talking about. But they would say, "What'd you say?"
Oh, I didn't say anything. I just said, "Oh."
They would say, "I'm sorry," and so I had never been Catholic, and I didn't know quite what to think about all of it. But then it led me, like you were talking about, to uncover layers of the onion, and kept going deeper and deeper. But it was real simple. They would say, "What do you feel? And where do you feel it? And what would you label it?" And then we would say, "Part of me feels," and then eventually we're dealing with inner child stuff and things like that. And it wasn't a cognitive thing. It wasn't something that we were just identifying, what was wrong with us. You didn't really know. Sometimes it's just your body's trying to correct this thing within you. Mm-hmm. And by feeling it and being present with it, not judging it, then it would start to shift. And something would be different. And like you're saying, it exposes kind of that truth of, then at the end, a guy that helps us with focusing would say at the end, well, it's no wonder you're anxious now
Yeah.
because what you just uncovered, and therefore try to remove the shame. Like you said, somebody else saying "me too" or "I hear you," I understand what you're saying, and I believe you, and I agree with you. Those kind of things are huge. I would say what the last segment you said, everything you said was right, in my opinion.
Well, good.
That I don't ever expect people to agree, you know what I mean? But we don't have to totally agree. But how do you see the future? So much of those high control religions are declining.
Yes.
So much of this trauma healing that we need so desperately is starting to happen.
Yay.
Starting to kind of have understandings of what's true about all that, like you've been talking about. What's your hope for the future? Maybe you have a message. Sometimes we say, what would you put on your billboard?
Yes.
You tell the whole world.
Yes, I'm hugely passionate about that. And I do see them declining, but we have so much work to do. It's so much work. So Bill Gothard's seminar, 3.5 million people went through that. Most of them were pastors, counselors, and ministry leaders. His teachings still infiltrate our churches today. So I work full-time for Peace Ministries in communications. So that means I interface a lot with women telling their stories. About 50% of them that I work with, I hear IBLP in their story, or I hear parts of it. And I'll say, were you in IBLP? Were you in a subset of this? And usually they were. And so we have to look at a lot of this is, well, one, I'm going to go in two parts of this. One, I'm huge into the work I do at Call to Peace because we work with churches. We help them understand the dynamics of coercive control and how they exist in their congregation and how you can partner with us to protect women and children that are impacted by them and call the oppressor to repentance. We do both. So it's very rare for oppressor to change. I will say that, but they can with right intervention, but it's only about 40% with right intervention. And so it's huge. It's a big deal. It's in our churches. Women that are in domestic abuse, most women that go through this with IBLP, I would say 50% of them ended up in domestically abusive marriages. 1 out of 3 women are sitting in your pews are in domestic violence. Most of them probably grew up in this program because we were taught to suppress our voice. We were taught no vocabulary for abuse. We were taught sex is never an option. You never say no. We were the perfect candidates for a predator. Not only that, men who were raised in it were raised to be abusers. No offense. They just were a lot of times. I'm not saying all of them are. I'm not saying that at all. There's men that are victims of this too, and they have stories and they're amazing. They're overcomers. I'm just saying they were also victims of this teaching as well. So we have to look at the impacts and the effects of where this is leading. It's these women that are caught in domestic abuse. It's men that are caught in these cycles and don't even know all of them don't even know how to have healthy relationships. So there's a lot of work that needs to be undone. It needs to be exposed. His teachings in the church need to be exposed. Pastors need to think through the fact of some of the stuff in their churches. Where does these things come from? Where do some of these teachings come from? Because the first place that a woman in abuse, do you know where she's going to go to that's a Christian woman? I think it's 80% of them reach out to their pastor. That's the first place they're going to go. Yeah. And they don't have any training on that to understand that. They're taught more things. And then she gets, sadly, more suppressed and things just don't go well. But I believe there's just a lot of education that needs to happen in the churches where you're understanding the dynamics of coercion, what it looks like, how it operates. Also, I've seen people pull out the umbrella. It's starting to be now pushed away. But that still existed in a lot of churches, and how we shaped and view our submission, how we shape and view a lot of different things in our marriage was influenced, in all honesty, by Bill Gothard. You've got to know the Duggars, how they influence people, and look at all those ways it's still in our churches, and it's still impacting people, and it's still oppressing them. And so I believe there's just a lot of work that we need to do. I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful that we can continue to talk about it. And there's so many amazing pastors out there that are willing to listen and to hear and to say, you know what? My pastor helped me escape my marriage. That's how I got out of my marriage, was my pastor partnered with, Joy IV, that's founded Call to Peace Ministries, worked with him. And he said to me, I know you've been very abused by a lot of men in life, but I want you to know there's men that will fight for you, advocate, and protect you. And it was in that moment that's my faith in God was restored. And so I do believe there's ways that there are churches that can help and partner, because a lot of these oppressors, while these women can find the support and community they need, and then it just also just kind of exposes it and what's going on in the churches as well. And so I think there's a lot to be done. It's IBLP is dying out, but the effects and impacts of that, it is long term. The care for women impacted by these teachings is long term, and the men impacted by these teachings too. Sorry, I work heavily with women, so it's on the tip of my tongue.
No, I know we're going to wrap things up, but one of my questions to you is, how do you answer or respond when someone says, well, I'm really sorry that happened to you, but that doesn't happen. That's not the experience of our church. That doesn't happen in our church. Because we have heard that, we'll share our story and people are like, well, that's not what happens in my church. I mean, how do you respond to that? Because I feel like what you're saying is true. It's very pervasive, and it's just that, are people not willing to recognize it? Do they not want to admit it? How do you respond to that when someone says it's not my church?
Domestic abuse? Well, if somebody said, what? I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
No, you're fine. Or just, just even the oppressive, umbrella, you said, statistically 1 in 3 women in our churches have been in or are in, some sort of abusive relationship. And that could be physical, emotional, sexual, mental. But I don't think, and of course, when we come into churches on Sunday, a lot of times, we come in looking like everything is great. I mean, I did that for years. Everything was great when it wasn't great. Mm-hmm. So I guess how do we get people to understand that this isn't just an IBLP situation? This isn't just a Duggar situation. This isn't just a high control religion situation. I mean, I'm talking with my sister now. We grew up in the Lutheran church, which doesn't seem to me at all like a high demand religion. But some of the things she's telling me, I'm like, wow, like she experienced it as very traumatizing. Mm-hmm. So it's there in our churches, but how do we get people to stop saying, well, not in my church. I'm sorry, that happened to you, but that doesn't happen in my church. How do we change our way of thinking so that we understand?
Because I think that's a terrible thing to say.
I agree.
It's a terrible thing to say.
The fact that it's happening anywhere should be, as a Christian, should be like, where's this happening? Because we need to stop this. Yeah. Anyway, that's my soapbox. I'll jump off now.
I liked your soapbox. That was awesome. Yes, absolutely. Any pastor that says it's not in their church, I will say you need education on coercive control. So you do not understand the dynamics of coercive control if you believe it's not in your church, because it's there. So I would, because I'm sorry, this is my world where I work, but we offer training, 4 hours of training on coercive control. And we would say any pastor that goes through that cannot say, once you see the dynamics of coercive control and how it shows up and look, you can't unsee it. So I would say that they're not aware of what coercive control is or even what it looks like. But if we sat down with them when the power and control went and started teaching them how abusers operate, how perpetrators operate within their congregation, they will see it. It's there. It's just, it's abuse is insidious. All of these teachings are insidious. It's hard to see. It's hard to discern by yourself. And so, yes, it's there. It's just the education is lacking, or it's, the support is lacking to be able to understand how it exactly looks in your congregation. But it exists. Absolutely. I mean, he's probably isolating her. You probably don't see her. I could start pointing out things in your congregation, things that are going on, and you'd probably be like, aha, yeah, that is there in my congregation. It's the humbleness to willing to say, okay, I'm willing to look at this, and I'm willing to think through, okay, let's talk about what this looks like, and what does, as a pastor, what does healthy thriving a community of a church look like that supports this and prevents this from happening within your church and within your community?
So good. And we appreciate the vulnerability and your bravery coming on to tell your story one more time. Appreciate it. And we will do everything we can. Laura asked this question. How can people find you? Where are you at? Do you want them to find you?
Yeah, that's fine. You can find me. Well, I'm Lauren Rose on Facebook. You're welcome to reach out to me there. I am also with Call to Peace Ministries. So if you went and found that on Facebook, you would find me as well there. You can email me. Well, just find me probably on Facebook would be a better way to contact me would be. And then you can message me and I'm happy to respond back as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Our grandson is joining in the podcast here.
Aww.
Now.
He's to join in every once in a while, but we are so thankful that you chose to share your story here on the Desert Sanctuary. And I, for one, when you talked about how part of our healing is telling people your story and having them believe you, I wholeheartedly agree. So we want you to we believe every bit of your story and just thank you for being willing to help people to heal that are listening to this podcast. So we really do appreciate your time.
Yes, absolutely. And there is healing.
Yes.
It's a long journey, but it does come.
Yeah. For everyone else out there, thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary. We hope that through Lauren's story, it helped you. And if it helps you, please let her know. It takes bravery and vulnerability, and it's hard to do this, but we thank her if her story blesses you. And as always, remind you to be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
You are seen
you are heard
and you are loved.